So what we did, we actually prepared for this session. What we did is we asked each other a few questions, and we brought the questions here for you guys. And the questions we built up are the questions that we actually think about it as we are building our data science models or building our data science teams as well. We don't have a canned answer for those today, and there's a lot of answers that we will be forming as we shape the industry within this space. So with that, I will start out asking my first question. Can you all hear me all right? Yes. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Many people think that ethics should be a black and white decision. I know you don't think it is. Why is that?
Yeah. So is everyone ready for a fun thought experiment to start the day? So we all like to think that ethics should be very black and white, very clear. And unfortunately, it's much, much more squishy than that. So the thought experiment is this. How many people here would say it would be unethical to kill somebody? Show of hands. Show of hands. Most people. Okay. Now, not all hands went up. So how many people think it is ethical to kill somebody? Okay. So here's where it gets dicey. People would say, typically are going to say, no, it's not at base. Every society in history has said you can't kill people. That's just a bad thing. But, and here's where the ethics get tough. Are there exceptions to that? Well, yes. And different people have different exceptions. So the one that you probably get well north of 90%, if I'm in my house, I see somebody shoot my neighbor, run out of their house, they come into my door with a gun. If I happen to take them out first, most people, but not everyone, would actually say that's okay. You can work your way down the scale like capital punishments, closer to a 50-50. Some 50 people will say yes, 50 people will say no. So the point is, you have something that's seemingly as clear and black and white as don't kill someone, and most everybody is going to have at least one exception. Once there's one exception, there could be other exceptions. So if we can't even agree that you shouldn't kill somebody in an absolute sense, then how are you going to have an easy time agreeing on much more ambiguous and less important decisions like, well, is it going to be okay to use this data in this scenario? And are there any exceptions where we could or couldn't build that model? It just really takes a lot of thought and deliberation with a group of people to figure out what the right thing to do is because it's not so clear.
Yeah, and we are open to taking questions from the audience as well whenever you are ready. So to that question, Bill, when I think about ethics and how each company is navigating those facts, some companies will think that it's right, some companies will think that it's not right, especially killing people. So how do you suggest companies should navigate the basis for ethics?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of making sure you're thinking it through. So there's a real life story that I experienced. It was probably 10-ish years ago now. Today, it's pretty ubiquitous. You go to a store, and then you get the receipt tape with a bunch of little offers on it. And I think CVS is the worst because you can get a tape, this long if you buy one item, right? So back when that was a little more new, I remember, and this true story, I was with the large technology company at the time, went into 2 different large retailers that did not have a loyalty program at the time, and said, you know what you can do these days now? We can capture all of the data, analyze it by credit card number, over time so that you'll still get the pattern. It's illegal to then, and I believe still today, to actually match that credit card number back to a name and an address. So you wouldn't necessarily know who they are, but when that card came back, just instead of saying, hey, Bill, here's some offers, thanks for coming back, it would say, welcome back, here's some offers, thanks for coming back. But analytically, it's substantively the same thing. And so I remember it was within 1 month, I visited both those companies. A month later, you follow up, and we had a conversation, what do you want to do? Company number 1 said, the lawyers agree it's totally legal. We've talked about it, though, and we don't have a loyalty program because we fear it's a violation of people's privacy. We don't think our customers want it. It's just not in keeping with what we do. We're not going to pursue this at all. Company 2 comes back. Well, the lawyers agree it's totally legal. Actually, even because we don't have a loyalty program, we have customers looking for ways to get value. We think they'd really value this. It's protecting it. We're going to go ahead and we'd like to explore doing some of this. And so you had literally 2 companies, same industry, same point in time, same facts, and they made 2 opposite decisions. But I would argue they were both ethical to your point because they went through a deliberative process and said, given our business, given our customers, given our mission and how we want to go about things, what is the right thing to do? They happened to come to 2 different opinions, but they did so in a very intentional, deliberative way that had good logic behind it.
Yeah, and we see that. So personally, we definitely at Northwestern Mutual have experienced that as well, where their ethics, every company define their own ethics principle by which they abide. And within mutual companies, we work with other mutual companies as well in partnership areas, and everybody has a different standard. It makes it sometimes really, really hard for you to launch products given the ethics principle that we go by, because data science in an unconstrained world can give you a lot of answers. Maybe not all answers are within the bounds of ethics. But as a company, we constantly struggle with, so we work very closely with our legal team, privacy team to help guide what the next steps will look like for us.
I think the key is to imagine, if you're a parent, are the parents who have a 10 o'clock or versus 11 versus 12 o'clock curfew, or one of them better parents? Not necessarily, right? It's a matter of, there might be very good reasons how they came to the conclusion. One of them might have decided 10. Maybe the kid had gotten in trouble once or twice and they want to be a little tighter. Maybe the other kid, they on the other extreme, they thought they had earned a lot of trust. So I think it's something that could vary as well. I might give my kid a 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. curfew now, but if they do something wrong, I'm going to ratchet that back as well. And I think that you have to maintain that right as a leader overseeing some of these analytics at organization to say, okay, because we've had some issues, we're going to tighten the rules a little bit. We want to make sure you all are focusing on this properly, and then maybe we'll loosen it up again, much like you might either get grounded or restricted a little bit by your parents.
Yep.
So I know obviously bias and avoiding it is a big issue that you need to be concerned about. So what are some of the steps that you all take at Northwestern when it comes to avoiding such things?
Yeah, so we are close to a $33 billion company, and we are a highly regulated company. So anytime we launch a model, we have a fairly robust model governance process that NM abides to. And this was when I joined Northwestern Mutual just a year ago. And prior to that, I was with another company with Bayer. And they had, and I know Pato is in the audience as well, but we used to have tons and tons of models. And we had a model governance framework as well. But the model governance framework was good for launching seed products, never touched an individual. With Northwestern Mutual, all the life insurance policies that we are serving the clients, we are touching clients' lives. So with that purpose, our model governance policy is extremely critical. Every model that we are launching into production that's making decision for a client's life policy or term life policy, we have to have, an enterprise. We have an enterprise risk exec committee, which definitely approves a model to go into production or not. So we need to seek approval for that. We have a fairly well-defined, what we call MRM framework, which is publicly available within NM for us to find, or anybody to find additional information on. But through that model risk management framework, we are very, judicious in ensuring that we have a model developer, a model user, and model owners are defined within the system. And model owners are the owners that are essentially defining the bounds within which, or the guardrails within which those models have to perform. So explainability is key for all the models that we put into production. There's not even a single model that will go into production if we don't have the explainability put in place for that. We do tons of peer review before the models get into production. So I would say if you're looking into, or thinking about AI bias or putting a bias framework within your teams or your organization, it's critical to understand a model risk management framework, which is widely available outside as well. And you just need to figure out which one is the best for you to adopt, by which you at least ascertain that your models that are going into production can be audited and are performing within the bounds of the framework. And we use Domino for model monitoring, for sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. What are some of the components of the ecosystem that you're using from you mentioned some of the processes from a technology perspective. How do you ensure that some of your policies are getting properly put in place, and also that you have the ability to flag when something is going wrong?
Yeah, it's not an easy process. So again, Northwestern Mutual, we have developed quite a bit this past year. We have a model risk management framework. So right now it is a manual process. It is Excel oriented, but it's well kept and well devised. So we have set of approvals that we go through, and that's within our Northwestern Mutual policy as well. It's written in the policy. So from the tech stack perspective, we have Databricks, and I've got all the engineers sitting right in front. So if you have any questions on the tech stack that we are using, I've got our engineers over here. But we have got Databricks, and the team is also building what we call Unified Data Platform. And then we just started our journey onto the Domino. We brought the platform last year, but now we are putting the model monitoring framework into place. We launched one of our production models into Domino model monitors. In terms of so those are the main tech stack that we are using. Again, our data scientists are on R, Python, which is where they're coding, and the Domino will give them the data science collaboration engine, which we don't have today. And we have multiple work streams that the teams are working through.
Interesting.
Yeah. Any questions from the crowd?
The question on how do you see companies which have global activity, global operations, very different countries with different moral aspects right, on how they take actions. What those companies are doing to kind of harmonize, have a clear aspect of how they apply ethics in their models?
Yeah, I can answer it. So the company that I'm at right now, it's a US-based company, but based on my experience, the lines, Nick covered it a little bit this morning, the lines between the GDPR and CCPA across, there's data transaction that we need to take care of as well once you start to go global. So again, lineage would be extremely critical in ensuring that data is housed within the country for which it is written for. So the data sources, data sets, the single source of truth that you need to maintain. And model, we haven't had to exchange model across the boundaries of a country, but it's the output from each of the countries that will deliver the value for the country itself. But ethics, when it comes to ethics, it's very geography-based. It's highly geography-based. So in Europe, we had a very different policies by which we abided. In the US, we had a very different policies by which we abided. And again, the decision as a company that one has to make, which always, GDPR starts out, CCPA came right after. And at that time, during GDPR, you have to make a decision. Do you just go after implementing GDPR only for Europe, or do you go after implementing for all of your countries so that you are taken care of? And those are every company will decide differently. In some instances where we ended up deciding is just take GDPR as the single source of truth, get that implemented across the organization. It puts us a little bit more conservative for the deployments that we were doing, but it just helped us quite a bit once the CCPA came into picture. We didn't have to add additional bells and whistles for CCPA. And ethics will have to, I bet will have to see the same thing and will have to start making the same decisions.
Yeah, and I just say, you're going to have to localize. So I think you could have let's say a corporate minimum standard, whatever that happens to be. That might be stricter even than some countries you do business in, but you're saying this is our corporate minimum standard. However, in specific countries, they may have local customs that require that to be more rigid. So I know like in the credit scoring arena, there are some countries you can throw any data you want in a credit model, demographics and so forth, things that are totally illegal here. So then you can ask it, well, if it's legal in that country, do we want to go do it or do we not want to go do it? But whereas in the US, you don't even have the choice. I mean, you're going to go out of business if you were to do it. And so I see parallels of this in general. It's unfortunate because it can cause overhead. I remember I spent time in retail and CPG space doing analytics, and some of these big global manufacturers, they have their product hierarchy that they want to standardize. But then sometimes there's a law in a certain country that like soda has to be classified in a certain hierarchy that doesn't match the corporate hierarchy. But for that country, they have to do it that way.
Yep.
And then you have to do all this reverse engineering of, okay, in that country, we have to officially do it this way. And then we have to build a separate process to remap everything for our own internal reporting, not the local government reporting. And I think it could be similar for ethics. We have a certain suite of models. In this country, we're going to have to either tune the models differently or turn them off and or just build our own models. And that's just, I think, part of the cost of doing it.
Yes.
Hi, thanks. Thanks in advance, and thanks for your thoughts. With distributed data science teams, they all will nod their head ardently that we should be both legal and ethical. When it comes down to practice, the legal stuff is really easy to get them motivated around because it's very explicit. And the consequence of being illegal is the brand, it's the press, it's the really dramatic outcomes. But getting people to be ethical, they nod their heads, but they kind of don't know what unethical looks like. Have you had any stories you could tell about something that is clearly legal but not ethical to teach?
Interesting.
Well, I could tell you, so you made a really important distinction that when I talk to companies, I always bring up, which is your bar cannot be, is it legal? Because what's legal is way looser than what most people would reasonably consider ethical. We talked about ethical being a little squishy, but there's plenty of things that are legal that I'll bet 99% of the room would say, no way could you do that. But that's not because it's been made explicitly legal, it's that laws haven't caught up to actually address some of these issues. So I think that's the key. It's not that there's laws out there allowing crazy stuff explicitly, it's that they maybe haven't even caught up yet to realize they need a law to prevent something that companies either are or could do to do it. So I think I always say, at the top, you'd love legal and ethical to be matched up, but they're not. The first pass has to be, is it legal, but you're not done. Then you have to get to ethical. But I'd argue that in many ways, even ethical isn't enough. And so the classic example, I'm sure everybody knows the Target story from years back. Show of hands, Target with the pregnancy modeling. So I won't get into too much detail. Point is, there's a third layer that's even tighter than ethical, which is what are customers or the consumers as a whole going to see as reasonable, and will they accept it? And so, we could dissect the Target pregnancy prediction was clearly a legal activity because they had a loyalty program, people signed up. I'd argue it was probably ethical in that it was one of 200 factors. They were predicting if you would buy sportswear, if you would, buy cereal, all kinds of things. If you were a healthy lifestyle, et cetera, that was one of many. No one was going in investigating people. But even if we could agree it was ethical, obviously people didn't like it. People said, yeah, that's a little too far. Maybe that, even though it's mathematically the same, we don't like it. And that's where they failed on that test. So I think it's not just is it legal and is it ethical, but even if we defended why this is ethical, are we still going to get beat up in the press because a lot of people might not agree with us? And that's a very real risk as well.
Yeah, and the way we are looking at, and we are right now living and breathing this, if you ask me at Northwestern Mutual, the way we are looking at this is we start out with, we have classified the features that we're going to use within our models. We look at all the features and classify those features as sensitive, prohibited, and allowable. And our legal team looks at that, and that's when they give the distinction to us on what is allowable to be able to use, what are sensitive, and what are prohibited. Prohibited we cannot use. That's done deal, right? Sensitive is something which is what we call unconstrained model approach, where we start to test out different models within the sensitive feature approach. And within each one of those sensitive features, we sit down with legal. It's a cumbersome process for sure, right? But it's the bad press. If it goes out, it's a bad press. And it needs to be ethical as well. So the sensitive feature, we have this question on can we or should we analysis. And that's a fairly robust analysis that we do where we have data scientists, business leaders, legal, and privacy team that sits together and make the decision on can we or should we. And then we look at the predictive ability of that feature as well, that what happens if we eliminate that feature, how much of the risk are we taking? Right, and if it's not a whole lot, then absolutely don't use it. If it is a whole lot, then there's another set of processes that discussions that happen after that with the exec team as well on can we, should we, which between the boundaries of legal and ethical, we start to make those decisions. But it's extremely critical, I feel like, is for us to define that process early on, because there's so much that is not defined within this space today from both the industry groups or from the regulations as well. There's a lot of development that has happened, maybe within the healthcare industry, we see that, and also on the credit-based industry. But some of the insurance policy industry, what they don't have is there's not a threshold defined by which you say that it's biased or not. So that gives room for everybody to have their own definition of what is bias. So again, we have to, I strongly feel that we have to work with NAICs and other industries to help shape it as well.
I'll throw out one thing that's interesting, and it gets back to, there are companies, in my opinion, some of the tech companies at times have pushed, if it's legal, we're doing it, and they've pushed it to an extreme. So how many people have heard that cookies are going away in terms of marketing tracking, right? And that's been delayed, but why? Well, the whole principle of having the cookies go away was so that people couldn't be tracked, even though you could opt out and stuff. It was still debatable. Well, what they're doing now, they're developing these browser fingerprinting methodologies wherein there's no way for me to opt out, and they can identify me even better than with cookies. So cookies go away. The whole purpose of that was to give us more privacy and less invasive analysis of our history, but they're going to replace it with something that is not legally a cookie, and that is actually better, and I can't opt out of it. And so, is that really a better solution? Like, I don't think it's a better solution at all. Personally, I've been a little frustrated with how this is all played out. But that's the kind of thing where it's tough, because it's legal to do browser fingerprinting to my knowledge, but I think it's against the spirit of getting rid of cookies. I may as well have a cookie I can opt out of than a browser fingerprint that I can't.
Yeah. So I'll ask my favorite question, Bill, and you know
Okay.
which one is this one. So it happened early last year. There was this ethics. Google was doing tons of work, and then Timnit Gebru. How many of you have heard her name? Some. So she headed the AI ethics department at Google and came up with a really nice publication on ethics related to AI, and worked with faculty and was about to publish the paper. And this was probably in January or Feb. We were right in the middle of the pandemic, and there was a big news flash came last year where she was fired from her job for trying to publish that paper. And there was a whole lot of debate within the ethics industry that started to prop up at that time in terms of having a whistleblower status for folks who are talking about AI ethics for the company that they're working with. So what are your views on that?
So I'm going to dissect that into two different components. So the first one is, I've always espoused, if you've ever been into a manufacturing plant, they're big on safety, obviously. And so a lot of cases, they've either got like red buttons, red pull chains all around. The idea is anybody, you could be the janitor, you could be the CEO walking through the plant. You see something you think is looking dangerous, you hit the button. Everything stops until it gets resolved, period. So I'm a big fan of, there ought to be a way that virtually anybody that's involved in the process of acquiring the data, analyzing it, if you're the business person utilizing it, you see something, this model doesn't look to be going right, can effectively hit the red button and have it explored. So that's kind of the interjecting of a safety mechanism. But your point about a whistleblower, it's a tough one for me in this sense. I think back to the gray areas, where it gets dicey with the whole Google scenario was, had she raised all the issues she raised internally and fought internally to make changes, then I fully support that I don't think she should be fired for that. But when you go and take it, the internal dirty laundry and make it all public, now that's a really tough one for me, because there may have been some things there, but was it right for us all to know that? And so this gets back to, I'm not claiming I have the answer to that. I'm just saying that it gets a little dicier. If we had heard that behind the scenes, she had been fighting internally and then got fired, I would have think that was more clear cut. But because she went public, then it's tougher. And so this gets back to the same thing. I would like to say that people who raise real issues would get taken seriously, and that internally they would deal with it. As a very last resort, I suppose you could go out and go public, but then it's really hard, because you get back to the laws, and at what point have you liabled your company, or at what point have you broken your employment agreement? I mean, there's so many nuances there that I think it's the best policy would be to start internal. And frankly, if there's a point where your company can't or won't react to what you see as a big ethical problem, then probably you should be quitting versus getting fired anyway. If I'm working for a company and I'm convinced they're doing something ethical, I'll quit, then I'll go public. Because at that point, what can they do? They can't fire me anymore.
Yeah. No, and that is something that we'll see how the industry, within US, how those evolve as well, because there's not a right answer right now. And those issues haven't cropped up that much today, but it will start to come up as there's more and more AI models that are going to go into production, and some of them, by default, will go off the rails every now and then. So more to come on this.
Yeah, so when you mentioned about going off the rails, what are some of the systems you have in place, as we talk about it, to make people accountable and to have risk management around the models? So you went through this process to get them approved, but maybe the data's drifted, or maybe the model itself has drifted over time. What do you have in place then to help identify and mitigate that after the fact?
Yeah, no, we are building a very robust framework around that. And so the models right now that we have a prediction data set, you have a actual data set that comes in, and you constantly look at your prediction with the actuals and look at the drift that's going to happen. The drift is not going to happen tomorrow. Drift is something that you'll see over time. And I see Jonathan sitting here with me, but he has done great work on the error propagation. That is something that we fundamentally believe in. With machine learning models, error propagation will come. And if you really want to know, if you're working on a lot of machine learning models, I would encourage you to pick Jonathan's brain, who is here, who has done tons of work and simulation around error propagation, how it can creep up within your models, and how do you mitigate that as more and more data starts to come in from the newer population. And in terms of the policy-wise, yes, we do have those model developers, model validators, model users defined, but we also have a fairly robust process of peer review. So anytime a model gets developed, then we have data scientists from other areas of the work that come in and peer review the original model that was developed. So those are the things that we put in place. Monitoring is huge in our space. As once the model goes into production, we look for what are the numbers on an everyday basis that are flowing through the models, and what are the decisions that model is making that is aligned to or not aligned with what we expected. So your expected versus the actuals on the model, so that you're looking at the drift on a constant basis. Domino model monitoring system definitely helps quite a bit as well. But for some of the things that we do, we have our own dashboard by which we look at how are the models performing.
I'll throw out one nuance that I think a lot of people forget about, which is the term bias. It's a statistical term, and people think of bias, demographic bias, gender, race, et cetera. But bias is just a mathematical bias. You should be examining bias generically. Maybe you're biased in the Northeast region versus the Southeast, or biased for product 1 versus product 2. It really just means that there's something going on in the model that your outcomes are disparate across any number of factors that could be important to your business. So I'd also encourage, it's not just about the sensitive things, but it could be equally damaging, although no one else outside the company would care, if your model's really biased to product 1 versus product 2, and it starts to hinder the performance of product 2. That's not going to necessarily bother your customers or regulators, because it's your own internal problem, but it's something that you all ought to care about and be able to identify. So it's a matter of saying, what are all the areas on which we'd like this model to perform well, and validating that there isn't a bias on any of those, not just the sensitive pieces.
Yeah. Yes.
A couple questions.
Oh, thank you. So when we talk about the legal and the ethical, sometimes we refer to them as absolute, but we know that they could change in time. Do you have examples of efforts that are driving towards influencing policymakers to change the legal, and then models or AI efforts that are changing the ethics of a society so that they can be more amenable for this type of technology? Think about, for example, when some countries are writing a new constitution.
Yeah, so do you want?
Go ahead.
So one thing what we have seen is, so when it relates to ethics and AI bias, and we hosted an AI bias symposium internally, and we brought in industry leaders to understand what's happening in this space. And one of the things that AI bias symposium absolutely helped us in understanding and bringing all of us, legal, privacy, data scientists, and our leaders as well, into the foundational basis where all of us align that there's a lot that is unknown in this space, and this space is evolving, and there's a huge opportunity for us to lay the groundwork on what this space can become. So, engaging, at least in the insurance industry, engaging with the NAIC or ACLI and helping them understand. So we have our data scientists, and there's Dion is sitting here. We have our data scientists who are engaged with the ACLI and NAIC to help shape what the policies, government regulations, and policy will become. Then there's this another, AI World Government. I don't know if you've heard about it or not. So AI World Government is actually working very closely with used to work with Trump administration, now they're working with Biden administration to help shape what are the laws and regulations by which all the companies needs to abide by. And this is where I feel like we have to have our voices and have to have strong data science communication angle by the data scientist itself. I personally always feel like, I was talking to somebody earlier today, is as data scientists, we worked really hard in training them to become scientific and talk about the science behind the work they're doing versus talking about telling a story and communicate that story better with the industry leaders, with the government as well. And this is where, when I think about the AI space and the ethics and bias related, this is paramount, that we need our data scientists to be able to come and tell the story as it is versus getting embedded in the technicalities of the story. Go ahead, Bill.
I would just say, I think well, there's a couple things to unpack there. I mean, certainly things, GDPR came about because of things started evolving and they decided we have to clamp down. I think the preferable scenario is if the industry groups, like some of the ones she's talking about, were proactive about these things. Because honestly, I'd rather have people like us in the room who care enough about this and do this for a living kind of talking amongst ourselves about what makes sense than having some random bureaucrats or elected representatives who know nothing about anything we're doing putting in place stuff. So I'd rather that we took ownership of it and did it. And so that's why I always say, even inside a company, it's being intentional about it. I call intentionality, where you have to ask people to be very intentional about considering ethics from the beginning to the end of a project. I'm a big fan, even your project charter document or your project proposals internal, have an ethics. Are there any ethics issues we should be concerned about with this? Or are there any new issues in terms of use of data? Like, just make everybody think it through as you go through the process, and you'll probably have better outcomes. And then let's go back to the public spectacle thing that's happened to some companies. So company number one, who hasn't been intentional, hasn't necessarily thought about ethics, has given lip service to it. Everyone has to agree they're going to follow the rules and such, and there's a big data breach or there's some model that runs amiss. It gets in the paper and their only answer is, oops, right? Well, what did you do to prevent it? Not much. Did you have any policies? Well, not many. And now they're going to get beat up bad. Versus company two, who's able to go, yep, look, we have this whole framework in place. We talked about it as we were chartering the project. We've been monitoring it. And what happened here is unfortunate. We didn't foresee it, and we feel really bad about that. We turned it off as soon as it was found, and now we've updated our procedures to do it. Now, they're going to get a little bit of a black eye in public, but they're going to fare much better with the public than somebody who got caught off guard. Because public understands some accidents can happen, and if you can prove and demonstrate that you were intentionally attempting to avoid that very thing, you'll be a lot more forgiving than if it's pretty obvious that you just got caught having not given it a thought. And some of the worst examples in the press have been companies that frankly just seem to have got caught without giving it a thought.
No, and that is fundamental, that is absolutely fundamental to have that baked in so that you can at least showcase. And we do tons of that where we abide by the frameworks that we have built in so that we have a full tons of documentation for the models. Not for all the R&D models, but definitely the models that are going into production and making decisions for the clients' lives. Yep. Yes.
And then I'll go over to you next.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, I'm curious, we've been talking a lot about the effects of this on business and how the business is seen. But at the other end of a lot of these algorithms are actual human beings, right? So like there's the algorithm for criminal sentencing, or algorithms as medical devices. And so I'm curious about our obligation to the end users of these algorithms once they have been found to be biased. Like, should we be having policies in place to try to not just take the algorithm out of production, but maybe provide some way to undo some of the damage that could have been done while that algorithm was being used on, people.
Mitigation is extremely critical, and be able to define a mitigation strategy for when you see that proxy discrimination, disparate impact happening. You should absolutely be, as you're building the model, proxy discrimination, disparate impact testing needs to be baked in and you can do that work under attorney-client privilege within your company or not within the ACP. But that is a must to be able to do so that before public knows about it, right? And I always say that your algorithm outcomes are as good as your data is. It's not the algorithm that goes haywire. It's the data that you put in, and you're expecting it to make decisions on something else, which is not going to happen. So most of the instances that you're mentioning, what happens is the data is not as diverse as one would hope for, and it's a sample size issue, and it's a data issue. And that's why I feel strongly that data scientists needs to be more vocal about these things versus the sound bites that we get in social media on the AI gone wrong, right? AI does not go wrong. Model is a model. It's intended to do something, but it's the data that is not as wide and horizontal as one would hope for to make the decisions for all the outcomes that you're wanting to go after.
I think that's key when you talk about the data. One thing folks don't think about is making sure that the data that every model we have, AI included, it's based on historical data of some kind. There's existing data. And so the challenge becomes, take that, you mentioned the criminal models, right? So what should we sentence this person to? It sounds great. We're going to look at 20 years of history across the whole US, and we're going to have it all averaged out in the model to get the best thing. That sounds great. But what if our opinion of how that crime should be treated has changed? So let's take one that's gone really wide in 10 years. Marijuana went from you're doing time all the time to some states it's completely legal now. If we build a model on historical sentencing from marijuana, it's going to be grossly over-punishing people in many cases today. And there's probably examples of other things that we've cracked down on. And so you always have to also say, is it relevant? And the whole 2008 market crash came, frankly, all these historical models that assumed that home values would always be flat or up. And as soon as that assumption was violated, really all their models were invalid. They didn't even have a way to account for it, and we all know, all know how that turned out. So that's one advantage, I think, of the pandemic, a silver lining. We'd all have rather it didn't happen. But there were so many disruptions of a magnitude and a nature that have never happened before that at least now there's data on. What would happen if literally no ships could get into port for 2 weeks? Well, we would never know that. At least now there's a little bit of data. And historically, I know some of the earliest ones in this area were like the home improvement stores around hurricanes and tornadoes and other things. They were able to model what exactly do we have a run on in these stores that are in a highly impacted area, and they started to front run it. So, a hurricane's looking like it's going to move through Tampa, ship all these specific items and get Tampa loaded up on them because we know that people are going to need them. And some are obvious, like the board and the nails, but there's other things that wouldn't have been so obvious. But that's an example. Again, they then had enough relevant examples of data from a hurricane or a tornado, et cetera, that they could look at those. And so, this is where sometimes these really big exceptions at least have now given us examples of real data, of a real impact of a scenario that previously we would have just been having to take a guess, quite frankly. So I think it's always making sure that your data really represents what you mean it to today, even if it represented what you meant it to at the time it was collected, and even if 6 months ago it still represented what you meant it to. This gets back to the ethics is intentional. Every time you go to update that process, you've got to rethink, is this data we've been using the last 4 years and the way we've defined it still the right way to do it? And at some point you might say, no, it's not, and now you got to revamp it.
And even for proxy discrimination, there's multiple ways to do it. You need to define what are the features for which you are going to look for proxy discrimination, right? And which will vary by the industry. It could be protected class, religious status, income, could be anything, right? But you need to be cognizant of what you're defining as your variables for which you're going to test the proxy discrimination disparate impact, that really provides you the guardrails within which your models have to perform.
So I have a question coming from the higher education space, which is the place that I come from. As we build curricula, we build academic programs at the undergraduate or the graduate level in data sciences, we're trying to build into that program, those programs, ethics as a component. But we're looking at it from our side. I'm very curious to hear from your perspective, what's the sort of preparation that you would want to see people coming out of these programs having specifically with respect to ethics?
Well, I'm also right now working at a university, and so one thing I think, I almost liken it to, I didn't go to law school, but what I envision law school from what you see in the movies and you hear is where they do case studies, right? And part of your class is you have to dissect what was good and bad about both sides of this specific legal case and how it got adjudicated in the end, and do you agree or disagree, et cetera. I think the same kind of thing, like that target pregnancy one is such a perfect one, right? Find that example. Find the examples like the chat bots that have gone haywire. You know, there's so many different examples. And then have the students go through this process of sometimes uncomfortable. You know, you've got to argue why this was perfectly okay, and you folks over here have to argue why it's not. Almost like the debate thing, and force them to go through the uncomfortable process of trying to look at it from all the angles and then think it through, because that's frankly what you're going to have to do in the real world. Back to it, it's not going to be black and white, really obvious. It's going to be a deliberation with a lot of judgment involved. And so I think the more they've been exposed to some real world scenarios where there has been either literal trouble or there has been debate about whether it could be trouble, and they go through that, the more practice they have at going through that thought process, the critical thinking and everything, which I think helps in life in general. I think the better, though, because it'll give them that grounding of, I've seen something like this before, and here's how we did it in class. Let's break our team up. You all fight for it, we'll fight against it, just to play devil's advocate against each other and see who we think makes the strongest case in our meeting tomorrow at 2. Just having that kind of a background, I think, could be very helpful.
I actually like that. So we work with Northwestern Mutual Data Science Institute. We may implement that. But from my perspective, I think definitely that. But at the same time, there's a Berkeley Institute of Decision Sciences, it's called BIDS. They built a new department a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, which is based on the convergence of sciences. So they've got legal, privacy. So folks who are studying in these individual sciences, they're merged together into a program called BIDS, and they are getting trained into ethics. Is not a topic for them right now, I bet it is now, but it's a convergence of sciences where they're training students to be cross-functional, because I fundamentally believe that now it's more and more critical to have talent being built into a cross-functional sciences. So that's for sure. And the other one is, I said it before, communication. That is so key for data scientists and data engineers to get really good at, because fake science is a term, but the social media science, the soundbite science is taking precedence over the true science. And if we don't let our data science and data engineers to be good communicators, we're going to fail as humanity on a massive scale. So if anything university can do around training, data scientists and data engineers to get better at communicating, that's going to take us long.